And we are here together in community for a very special edition of DEI Fridays. It is special because this event is being co-sponsored with the Coalition to Undo Racism at Baruch, otherwise known as CURB. It is sponsored by the Marxe DEI Committee with funding from Brezzi, and we are so excited to be co-sponsoring this with CURB today. We are excited to welcome Dr. Wendy Moore from Texas A&M. She's going to be talking about navigating and resisting white institutional spaces. And we are just so happy to see every single one of you here today from throughout the college. Please put your name in the chat. Let us know where you're at. And we're going to start with what we always start with, which is a very brief grounding to get us situated and ready to start this session. Get rid of whatever you were doing from this morning and push off a little bit what you're going to be doing at 1 o'clock when you get off the Zoom. I invite you to get comfortable right now, wherever you are, sitting, standing in your space, maybe lying down. These spaces are for you, our community, so please feel free to keep your cameras on or off. I will invite you to just breathe with me for about 30 seconds. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes. I invite you to try and slow down your breathing. As we slow down our breathing, and in particular as we breathe through our noses, in and out through our noses, that is a way of telling our bodies that we are okay, that we are safe, that we are calm. And as you notice, even my voice slows down, my speech slows down immediately. It is me working with my body to get more comfortable and grounded in this moment. This week is Mental Health Awareness Week at Baruch. And I want to invite you in this moment to think about what may be coming up for you today. Feelings, heaviness, excitement, happiness, exhaustion, all those things that come out at the end of the week. Take a couple more deep breaths and then we're going to come back together. Just let those feelings come up, just acknowledge them, they're here with us. And now I want to welcome you to come back into the space, to let your body kind of again get comfortable, let your breath come back to its normal rhythm, and to open up your eyes slowly. I welcome you today to this space. We will read our community agreements together. We do this every week. I will have a couple of you just read 2 agreements each. Just put your name up in the chat. While I do that, I'll just tell you that next week we have DEI Friday. It's going to be special as well. It's going to be an hour and a half long, and we are going to be centering Indigenous voices. Unfortunately, the folks from the Lenape Center cannot join us, so we will be having people from the Native Governance Center that's based in Minnesota, and we're excited to join them, have them join us here. So go ahead, put your hands up, and we will start with reading our community agreements. Who can I welcome to the floor? Thank you, Christina. Go ahead.
Want me to read 2?
Yes, please.
Okay. We are a community in progress. We can struggle together. We can grow together. We will practice active listening, respectful language, and kindness.
Thank you. Teresa?
We can ask for literacy moments when there are terms we are not familiar with. We assume positive intent, and we also take responsibility for impact.
Thank you. Ryan?
We value each other's lived experiences and appreciate the vulnerability necessary to share them. We are willing to slow discussions down to facilitate the exploration of complex, nuanced issues.
Thank you. And Tiffany?
We are prepared for discomfort around these topics. If content seems inappropriate or harmful, we will pause the discussion and may ask folks to discuss privately with the facilitators. If you need support during the presentation, please direct message the facilitator.
Okay, thank you so much. So again, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. This topic is really something that has brought people across Baruch to this session, and also kind of mentioned to me, oh, I can't make it, but I'm going to watch the recording. I'm excited that you're recording this. I want to introduce first, before we hand over the discussion, which will be with Dr. Angie Beeman and Dr. Wendy Moore, I want to introduce my two colleagues, Natalie Pinella and Thomas Rainey, Tom, who are, colleagues and friends of mine. We've worked together for a long time. They are the current co-facilitators and organizers of CURB. I'd like to invite you to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Hi, friends. Good to be in this space with you. And as a representative and a co-lead of CURB, CURB is the Coalition to Undo Racism at Baruch. We are a group of faculty and staff members who have participated in the Undoing Racism workshop offered by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And so it's a heavy workshop. After it happens, you need a space, you need a community kind of to process and to hold yourself accountable to doing this type of organizing and work. And so CURB stands on the shoulders of giants, some in this room. We are a group of folks that got together from the legacy of folks in Seek. And so Angie Anselmo and Bill Ferns and Elizabeth Merrick in this space right now. And we are just a group that comes together to process, and Tom will tell you a little more.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Anna, thank you so much for having us. And everyone, great to be with you. Yeah, as Natalie mentioned, I think the key word that came out of what she was saying is accountability. We do like to come together in the CURB space, really just to hold a mirror up to ourselves and the work that we do and the gates that we keep here at the college as it pertains to students, faculty, staff, admin, everybody here at Baruch and within CUNY. And really just look at our spheres of influence and be there to reinforce to each other as coalition members that we have to and we must look at our work exclusively through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we all have a lot of power here at the college, whether we're entry-level positions all the way up through, professors, deans, et cetera. And it's important that we just remain accountable to ourselves and to each other. And that's what the CURB space does, is to just reinforce that.
Great, thank you so much. The last thing I dropped in the chat before we begin is something that a different group on campus, the DEI Incubator and the Office of Health and Wellness here at Baruch, put together every Monday. It's a space for 30 minutes called Mindful Monday. The flyer is in the chat, and I bring that up because there are a lot of opportunities on campus to do this work together and to, as Natalie and Tom described, to keep each other accountable, but in the kindest and most gentle way. Because I have to say, like, sometimes the word accountability for people like me who are a little bit perfectionist, then it becomes a lot of pressure, right? What am I doing wrong? What am I not doing? But I want to tell you all that these spaces, you show up in these spaces, and it's to learn and to grow together and to have support around these issues. So I just want to invite you to show up and just kind of see where it's at. And now, without any further words on the topic, I will just say again, first Angie Beeman, I want to thank you for helping to organize the session, for connecting us with Wendy. So many of us are excited to hear what she has to share today. And again, Dr. Wendy Moore, we are so happy to have you here, zooming in from Texas A&M. And I will now hand the conversation over to Dr. Angie Beeman, who is a professor here at the Marxe School. Go ahead, Angie.
Thank you, Anna. And a quick shout out to Professor Sadali Malaku, my accomplice in the Department of Management at Zicklin and co-author, who connected me with Dr. Wendy Moore. So thank you for that. I am honored. I'm so glad that you are all with us today, and I'm honored to introduce you to Professor Wendy Moore, who is a sociologist and lawyer whose work focuses on the provocative intersections of race, law, and legal institutions. She received her PhD from sociology, or PhD in sociology from the University of Minnesota, and her JD from the University of Minnesota Law School. And she's currently an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Texas A&M University. Her award-winning book, Reproducing Racism, White Space, Elite Law Schools, and Racial Inequality, analyzed the racial dynamics in elite U.S. law schools using a critical race theory lens. And in this book, Dr. Moore created a cutting-edge theory of white institutional space. Her research currently is focusing on how colorblind abstract laws of the post-civil rights era continue to facilitate racial hierarchy and white supremacy. Dr. Moore is a previous chair of the American Sociological Association's ASA section on racial and ethnic minorities, and she's also served on the ASA Council, ASA Executive Committee, and ASA section on Racial and Ethnic Minorities Publications Committee. Dr. Moore, we welcome you into this space, and we thank you very much for taking the time to share your work with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I very much appreciate it.
So I wanted to start off with some definitions. So I know this concept of white institutional space, it's a complex concept, and I don't think a lot of the people with us today, people have varying levels of expertise. So if you could start us off with defining that for us, what you mean by white institutional space.
So I want to begin the explanation by saying that I was talking with Angie and Anna beforehand, and I was saying that I was struggling to, actually for a couple of days, I've been struggling on how to answer these questions and stay in a reasonable time period. And, you know, I'm a professor. I think a lot of us here are professors, so I can talk for a very long time. So I'm going to try to be really brief and spend more time after we have this conversation on answering questions, because I think it's more valuable. So white institutional space is a theoretical concept that I developed. I really actually developed the theory because white space was something that was talked about by students of color in law schools. And I used it early on when I was a graduate student. I used the concept, it's a white space. And everybody said, well, you have to define white space. And I was like, doesn't everybody know what white space means? Because we're all using it, right? But they were like, well, you're getting your PhD in sociology, so you have to explain it. And so I was like, all right, well. So I spent that book kind of taking everything that I had learned to come up with this theory of white institutional space. And what the concept of white institutional space attempts to capture are the mechanisms, well, more than that, sort of how are the spaces that we interact with in law schools, but also in employment arenas, like, for example, law firms, which Sadali Malaku has articulated, and in business schools and in management schools and in colleges and universities generally. How are they organized in such a way that creates white normative sort of understandings of the space, and also sort of embeds, re-embeds, I guess reinstantiates white norms, but also mechanisms that ensure that the resources that come out of those institutions and organizations are funneled disproportionately to white people, right? And the theory more broadly, right, looks at connecting what we think of and talk about as institutions, so things like law, education, and organizations, so specific law schools, specific education, specific employment organizations, connect to the social structure, which is historically organized around the concept of white supremacy. How does a history of, for example, explicit exclusion of people of color from spaces like colleges and universities lend to a knowledge, a curriculum, a knowledge core, so the theorists were teaching, right, that comes along with the exclusion, deliberate exclusion, right, historically, of people of color. So epistemologies, ontological questions that are being asked in communities of color historically don't make it into our colleges and universities, right? That that historical exclusion leads to a foundational white space, which I use the example of curriculums and knowledges, right? But you could also look at things as broadly as how do we teach and who got to decide what the best mechanisms were teaching? How do we organize our space, right? The hidden curriculum. So in the law schools that I studied, I saw one of the schools that I was at had done a project to get rid of just most law schools. If you walk into them, right, they have all of these images of white judges and white legal minds from history, because those were the only people who could participate. One of the schools I was at did put sufficient money into the physical space to bring in art from African American and indigenous or communities, and inspired by sort of their role in the law. And so what I found after the fact was that what they had in those spaces was pictures of protests, African Americans, the civil rights movement, pictures of folks at AIM. So I went to the University of Minnesota Law School, so the American Indian movement began there. So pictures of people protesting, pictures of, you know, representations of people fighting for their rights. But what happened at the end of that, right, is that you have in the classrooms all of these pictures of judges, presidents, you know, governors, and then in the hallways you had pictures of people of color fighting for their civil rights. And so that balance was still there, right? And we see, where do Black and indigenous folks go and where do white folks go? And in the halls of power, they're very different places, right? I can feel myself getting into, I'm like a stone going down a hill, like collecting moss. So let me just say really quickly that the contemporary mechanisms combine this sort of hidden curriculum, which is all of the things that were historically sort of became a part of it, with abstract liberalist discourses that don't really focus on race, with gaps between practices and discourse that facilitate white norms and an understanding that white spaces are naturally for white people and people of color are visitors. I'll give some more examples with the other questions that Angie is going to give me, rather than going on more there. But so the idea is capturing the mechanisms that function to reproduce organization that is organized around white norms and that is funneling, often tacitly funneling the resources of those organizations and institutions to white people.
Well, I think that you did answer part of my next question about examples of how this shows up in colleges and universities. So that's great. I think we could really benefit from those concrete examples. So I want to move on to something else in your work. Your work also addresses micro-resistance. And in your work, you've stated, quote, a more nuanced conceptualization of resistance in the context in which resistance occurs to understand the everyday experiences of people of color is needed. So could you tell us more about that, starting with what micro-resistance is and what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'll try to include some more examples as well. But so if we look at microaggressions, which is kind of, a lot of people have talked about microaggressions. I think about, and I think more people are articulating this in their work right now. I think about microaggressions as kind of this term that has kind of come to mean everything that goes on in white spaces, because some of them are not very micro, some of them are super macro. So, you know, I think what happens is in white institutional spaces, they're very all-encompassing, and we've really failed to consider that. I think in meaningful and important ways in terms of both articulating knowledge about racial inequality, persistent racial inequality in organization and institutional, sorry, now I'm trying to talk fast, institutional spaces, but also in terms of how we would craft solutions to make our spaces more equitable, right? And what we're missing is understanding that when folks of color are going into a white institutional space, sort of everything about that space is white. It's not about one individual or whether they're racist. It's these assumptions about how organizations run that routinely require folks of color in those spaces to negotiate and manage whiteness. I think that Sadale articulates it really well when she talks about the concept she developed in her work, the inclusion tax for Black women who are in those spaces. So one example that she and I have talked about before is hair, right? For Black attorneys who in this profession, which is both predominantly white and has a very particular way in which you're supposed to bring your physical appearance into the profession, that managing and negotiating hair, right? Their hair, which just grows out of their head in a regular biological sense, but having to figure out how to fit it into a courtroom or into the law firm is a form of emotional labor, right? Labor that is sort of unrecognized, unrewarded. So that exists. So micro resistance, the way we were talking about it, you know, when we talk about social activism or resistance in general, most people have focused historically, especially in sociology, on, you know, the civil rights movement, the racial equity movement, or what I would argue is another civil rights movement that took place in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. We think about those as resistance, but what we don't think about as resistance are the what Laura L. Khoury calls the revolutions of everyday life. Those times when people of color are engaging in activities that make it possible for them to continually do this emotional labor. So one of the things that Sadale talks about in her work and that we talk about in the article that we wrote on micro-resistance is the way in which connections are made. So things like this, so the connections that happen, for example, in law schools, as one example, Black Law Students Associations, Latinx Law Schools Associations, where they're able to create a space so they can go and process, oh yeah, that was white racism. I felt like I was going crazy. I felt like I was, you know, there was something wrong with me. And so folks come together and they say, no, you know, so when I had an example of a, well, actually, let me use another example. So when we have things going on like discourses about needing to have more faculty administration of color in colleges and universities, and these conversations are being had everywhere, and we're going to do everything we can, and we are doing everything we can. But then when there's a position that occurs, right, a white person is hired. And so there's not obviously a meaningful assessment of what it means to make a commitment to diversity. Being able in those spaces to say, this isn't about me, I wasn't unqualified, I wasn't less qualified, let me say, although most of the rhetoric that goes around hiring especially has to do with the assertion of neutral norms, right? That just mean that, well, the white person was more qualified. But in actuality, the norms aren't neutral, the assumptions aren't neutral, the evaluations aren't neutral. And what we end up with is, again, a hiring of white folks sort of over and over again. And that's how we end up with the statistical, right, inequalities that persist over time. So the revolutions of everyday life are about how do we manage that? How do we navigate it in every sort of way? So for example, a lawyer wearing big earrings that are in the shape of the continent of Africa, those kinds of things happen explicitly. Like today, I'm wearing my Africa earrings, and that is a form of resistance. It takes energy you know, you could be questioned about it, right? So I routinely wear, like routinely now, whenever I go on campus, Black Lives Matter shirts onto campus. I do it in part because I'm white doing this work and in this space, and there's a different reaction to me, but I understand that that is an act of emotional resistance other folks might not see as resistance. So those kinds of things, from, again, to rearticulate, from having spaces where you can go together and say, this isn't about me, this is about white supremacy, the way it's organized, right? Or white norms, the way they're organized, that's resistance. Wearing that Black Lives Matter shirt in a space where you know you can be confronted, that's resistance. One of the things that is emotional labor, but is also, in my opinion, resistance, is credentialing yourself. Like saying, when somebody says something, right, about you, makes an assumption that you're a cafeteria worker instead of a professor, right? Saying to that person, I have this degree and this degree and this degree. Those are micro resistances to the kinds of micro and macro aggressions that happen along the lines of race. I really should have made a time limit with each of these categories, but I did not do that. So I'm gonna stop. And we can talk more as we go on.
Right, exactly. And again, you answered other questions that I had about DEI initiatives. And I'll just point out that in some of my work that I'm doing right now with racial targeting, and how faculty and staff who do this kind of work are being targeted internally and externally. And I know you've had those experiences. One of the things that I noted about micro resistance for some of the faculty of color doing this work is withdrawal and like refusal to
100%.
To present in certain spaces. Like, present your work, we want you to present your work. But for people who aren't familiar with that work, just dealing with the kind of questions that get asked and having to defend your work in a certain way, which I don't think is expressed or manifest the same for different faculty and staff. So I want to make sure there is time for questions from the audience. So if anyone wants to.
Just one more bit of information that I just want to share really quickly, especially because y'all are going to be talking about Indigenous rights next week. We actually found out, so Governor Greg Abbott in Texas has initiated some executive orders. They're also working on legislation, which is about, undoing DEI efforts. But his executive orders have said that state colleges and universities have to remove DEI statements from their websites, et cetera, and stop doing DEI. We found out actually Wednesday that, so about a year and a half ago, it was after the murder of George Floyd, but some of our Indigenous students came together and they made a land acknowledgement statement. The American Sociological Association has done it. Lots of associations have included it and done it. We put it on our website. The diversity committee, which I'm on in the Department of Sociology, worked with them and we put it on our website. The general counsel at Texas A&M, who has been an individual for me, told our dean, and the dean told the department head that we had to remove it, and it was removed. It was removed on Tuesday, and they told us about it on Wednesday. And I actually teared up in my faculty meeting, which is not something that I do very regularly, because it's such a symbolic act to have it there, right? It's really not doing any structural work at all. But we are so currently invested in white retrenchment that things like that are happening, and hopefully y'all will be okay with me swearing, because I'm about to. You can turn your sound off if you want to, but I feel like that's the biggest fuck you to Indigenous students that we could possibly think of. Like, you can't even have this little 3-sentence acknowledgement. It's too much. So, questions.
We have a question in the chat from Betsy Yoon. I don't know if you want to unmute and share it, or if you prefer that I read your comments.
I can read it. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think earlier in your talk, thank you for coming. Earlier you mentioned, the origins of white supremacy and shaping this country and current institutional dynamics. And I think it's well acknowledged that the origins of white supremacy are really deeply tied in with capitalism. And so I'm wondering if you see the scope of resistance as needing to involve an analysis of capitalism and the constraints that capitalism places on possibilities for liberation.
So just me personally, I do believe that we need to look at the intersections between capitalism and the maintenance of white racial oppression. I think that that's in part because, there's two aspects of the history, right, that make that important and relevant. One is that the capitalist economy that we have is in large measure only possible, more than large measure, only possible because of unfree labor or enslavement, right, of racialized, the institution of racialized slavery in this country that made it possible, right, and that again made white folks able to hoard resources to the exclusion and exclude Black and Indigenous and then over time other people of color from getting those resources. So I think it's important that we understand that. And I also think that capitalism gets used as a tool to further maintain oppression or to reproduce the material consequences of racial and racial oppression in this country is not just material, it's more, but the material resources or the material elements of racial inequality and racial oppression that play out. Capitalism becomes a pretty strong tool in reproducing that. So I do think that we have to consider capitalism. I think we have to consider class. I think we also need to understand that race gets constructed in this country in relationship to class. In other words, as Cheryl Harris said, with her articulation of whiteness as property, she said, property, right, gets articulated through race and race gets articulated through property. So the idea of who can own property, white people, right, who cannot, and she talks about Indigenous people, she's looking at the origins, and who becomes the object of property in our legal sort of structure, African Americans, West Africans, that those phenomena remain today. They're much less explicit, but they remain today. And so I think that we definitely need to both think about how to include a critique, at least at minimum, if not an explosion of capitalism, at least a critique of capitalism in creating racial justice, but also understand how race is constructed in this country in connection to what is now an advanced capitalist society, right? So I'm not sure that fully answers your question, but it's just kind of what I think about when I think about capitalism. I see another question from Jenny that's about gender. You want me to, you want to articulate it? Do you want to?
I'm coming off of doing some research on graduate education and definitely, not law school, but just generally looking at graduate spaces and looking at the barriers that students are facing. And I didn't come into it looking for the kind of barriers that you've been researching, but just more broad, even institutional barriers that are very frankly bureaucratic, or you know what I mean, like really kind of so dry. But what I was noticing is some really big discrepancies in terms of gender and how that was influencing people's experiences. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are and what you've seen in your work, because I'm sure, especially as you were talking about appearance initially in your talk, because I was thinking back to the presidential campaigns of years ago where like Hillary Clinton in her pantsuit and people were really judging her appearance and then how they don't judge men's appearance. And so as you were talking about appearance or what you choose to wear as a form of kind of resistance, but also sometimes being very female. So I'm just wondering how gender comes up in your work or you avoid it in your work, because I know sometimes intersectionality makes things muddy, but just curious. So,
yeah, I don't avoid gender. I think that gender is important, but I do have in my work, especially in my book, focused on race to the exclusion of gender in a way that's deliberate because because I didn't think that there was a good explanation of race in social organizations. There was of gender. So Joan Acker's work, she did a really good job. I used her work, right? But also because when you look at gender and race, particularly when you're looking at spaces like educational institutions, the way that gender plays out is different and intersects in complicated ways with the way that race plays out, so that you would have to do a project that was kind of different from what I was doing. Now, what Sadali has done with respect to looking at Black women and how their race and gendered position in these professional associations is necessary to understand. In other words, you have to look at race and gender to understand what she's articulating. I think that that's really important and powerful. But I want to say that there's differences, right? So white women have historically, and especially today, are deploying gender in a way that is incredibly racist and aligns them with white supremacy. And so, whereas Black women, right, are having to navigate these race and gender spaces in a way that makes them have to face continually more micro resistances, right? And so I don't think that you can't do that work. I think you absolutely can. But I think that those kind of complications about the way that race and gender plays out, for example, for white women versus African-American women, and the way that white women, especially at this historical moment, are really kind of, obviously not all white women, but, as a category, are aligning themselves with racist formations, maybe I would say, and racist politics. I think right now it's really important to just talk about race. And let me just say sort of explicitly, because, and I absolutely understand this is not what you are doing, so I hesitated to say it because I don't want you to feel like I'm saying this to you, but more generally in my work, one of the things that I find is when I give, especially because I'm a white woman, I think when I give these talks on race, white women want to talk about gender because they're more comfortable talking about gender, which to me is a racialized activity that's taking place, right? And so that's also part of the reason that I don't focus on gender. I think that there's room. I think that people should do it. I think that it's important. I think that it would be really fascinating for somebody to look at these different ways that intersectionality, for example, for Black women or other women of color and white women would be. My decision not to is for those reasons, kind of explicitly. You get it? So like, that's the reason that I'm holding sort of race steady in the front. And I think it's important to do it. I hope that I articulated that well. But yeah.
So I know we want to save time for breakout rooms, but there is a question in the chat about teaching from Hamad. I think it's important. I don't know if you want to share that.
Oh yeah.
We could just read. Is Hamad here?
Yeah. So I think I know what you mean, Dr. Moore. I'm thinking of people like John Dewey and Jean Piaget, really the people who articulated pedagogy and progressive teaching methods. And I talked to a lot of, for my own research, I talked to a lot of educational technologists. And these are very, very white spaces. And these are the people making educational tools and products, and embedding their values in those teaching products. But that's how I'm relating it to something that's happening in my head. But what's your analysis of the whiteness in teaching methods?
So I in law school, and so ever since I've been teaching, I use critical race theory, and not just teaching critical race theory, but one of the things that I think it was a combination of sociology and law, right? Those backgrounds coming together for me. So one of the central things, which doesn't get talked about as much in the current conversations about critical race theory, which are absurd, but anyway, sorry. One of the main tenets of critical race theory is centering the knowledges of people of color, right? And from a so that gets played out in critical race theory as narrative, as voices that have been excluded. But with sociology, when I really started to articulate what that meant and sort of combine critical race theory as stemming from legal scholarship to sociology, is that what we have is this intensely, well, let me say, like, fundamentally embedded methodological error in our teaching. Because again, what I was talking about before, the knowledges of people of color have been excluded, right? And as a result of that, for me, I think that it is essential to correct for that, right? And so I utilize the scholarship disproportionately of scholars of color when I talk about race, right? And even when I talk about other things, because and I see that as a correction of a methodological error in our knowledge production historically. And so from a vantage point of sociology, there's people like Mary Romero, Alda Morris, who are doing work on talking about how women's voices and women of color in particular have been excluded from knowledge, and how how we teach about Marxe and Weber, the Chicago school, but we don't teach about Du Bois and the Atlanta school. And so those are things that I try to center in my teaching, in my scholarship, everything. So for me, it's not only saying we need to hear from people of color, we need those narratives as the way some people describe it, as kind of a kindness, right? Or inclusivity, we could all be friends. But it's also analytically correcting for a deeply embedded methodological error in our knowledge production.
Do we want to go, so Anna, what do you think? Do we want to go into breakout sessions just so that we have time? Because I feel like there's a lot to process here. I could listen to Wendy all day long.
I know, Angie, this is always the tension. I think, as I mentioned to Wendy when she came in earlier, that this is, for us who are organizing this space, it's always this tension, wanting to hear more from the speaker, but also wanting to really think about how to bring this back to the community. So I think we will stop here. And first, again, I want to thank Angie. Thanks for making this happen. Thanks, Sadali, for putting us in touch. And this is why community is so important, and these connections to have brought Dr. Wendy Moore here today. This has been fantastic. I think this is, really it's about planting the seeds and giving us a sense of kind of the work that you do, some of the resources in the chat, and even just some of the terms that you described, you talked about. I love the, everyday revolutions, right? The revolution in everyday circumstances, and thinking about these, micro resistances and some of the micro, and as you said, macro aggressions. I mean, just, to me, one thing that really stood out is what you described about the website and that acknowledgement. And would that be a microaggression? Because it seems pretty macro, right? I mean, it seems like a small thing, but that is exactly. Anyway. So just to say that I think you've really given us a great grounding in some of these terms, and now it is our chance to go and do some work on that and reflect. And so we will say thank you very much, and we will let you go back to. Thank you. Oh, yes, please. So
I just really want to say thank you. Right now, teaching what I teach, and it's been an exhausting couple of years. And so it is just so lovely to come into spaces where people want to hear what I have to say and value it, and especially go forth and do things with it. So thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wendy. All right. So Wendy will let you go whenever you want to go, hang out, leave. That's cool. For the rest of you, I would love to invite you first. If you have to go, we understand. Some people end up having to leave a little bit earlier before the breakout rooms, but I will invite you to stay for the breakout rooms, because this is where all the magic happens. And often people ask me to make the breakout rooms longer, and I'm like, but look at the gems we're showing. So who knows? Anyway, this is what we're doing for today. We're going to have 10 quick minutes, and I mean just 10, okay? So we come back and just say goodbye. And we have 2 questions that we want to work on in these breakout rooms, right? Do you see them? What does micro resistance look like in your life? And if you're not doing it, maybe how could it look? And in the spaces that you inhabit here at Baruch and in other places, and what are some of the main takeaways that you got from this conversation between Angie and Dr. Wendy Moore. So we are going to have small and intimate groups. I love that. Maybe 3 participants each. If for some reason you want to hang out here and talk, great, sure. Otherwise, go to your groups. I will let you know when there are about 2-3 minutes left. Okay. See you very soon. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for participating in those breakout rooms. This is just, again, a quick thank you to those of you who are watching this video right now. A thank you so much again to Dr. Wendy Moore, to Dr. Angie Beeman, to Dr. Sadali Melaku, who also, helped in making this session possible, and to each and every one of you who are here building this community and sitting in these uncomfortable places when we're talking about things like white institutional spaces, which we are in here at Baruch College. So we're here almost every Friday. Check our sessions out. For those who have to leave, we thank you very much. And for those who are watching, thanks again.